Hi everyone, my name's Dr. Mark Ettensohn. Welcome to Heal NPD. Spend even a few minutes searching for videos about narcissism online, and you'll quickly find a vast ecosystem of content creators who claim to have a high level of expertise on the subject. Some claim to derive this expertise from working with victims of narcissistic abuse. Others claim it from religious or spiritual perspectives. Some claim personal experiences of abuse. They were the victim of a narcissist. While others still claim to have encountered narcissism in the course of legal or forensic work. Strangely, almost no one claims expertise from actually working clinically with everyday, non-incarcerated individuals who have significant pathological narcissism, or NPD. And this creates a peculiar disparity. There are millions of hours of content about narcissism online, but almost none of it is from people who actually work clinically with pathological narcissism. Instead of discussing the clinical reality, many content creators discuss something that I call popular narcissism. Popular narcissism is an amalgamation of multiple traits and characteristics: psychopathy, sadism, callous indifference toward other people, interpersonal manipulation, deception, arrogance, cruelty, paranoia, and vanity. What most people think of as NPD is really popular narcissism. It's a vague, highly stigmatized portrait of self-serving and insensitive traits, utterly disconnected from any coherent motivation or psychological depth. According to a number of very popular narcissism channels, the narcissist can't be bargained with. He can't be reasoned with. He doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear, and he absolutely will not stop, ever, until he drains his victims of their humanity. To be fair, I just used Kyle Reese's description of the Terminator, from the movie of the same name, describing a ruthless killing machine sent from the future to exterminate humanity. But I think it's telling that those lines work in either context. It shows just how far down the rabbit hole of stigma and fear our culture has gone. Most people take it for granted that this stereotype represents the reality of NPD. It feels real, it circulates endlessly, and it shapes the way we think about narcissism. But if you read the serious peer-reviewed literature about actual NPD, or speak to anyone who actually works with this population clinically, you'll see a much more humanized portrait. So how did we get here? How did this figure of popular narcissism become so compelling, and why does it seem more real than the clinical reality itself? Here's the short version. The DSM criteria are unifactorial. They focus on just one facet of pathological narcissism: grandiosity. Every listed trait is simply another restatement of that theme: arrogance, fantasies of perfection, entitlement, exploitation of others, lack of empathy, need for admiration, envy of others or belief that others are envious, the sense of being special or unique. All of these collapse into the same factor: the person is grandiose. Thankfully, in the last decade or so, there's been growing criticism of the DSM model and its singular focus on grandiosity. That's because for over a century, the clinical literature has described narcissism as a combination of both grandiosity and vulnerability. People with NPD are just as likely to present as depressed, sullen, withdrawn, ashamed, humiliated, or socially anxious as they are the grandiose stereotype. But by the time those critiques began gaining traction, the DSM picture of NPD had already taken root in our culture. It's the perfect object for cultural projection: a vain, entitled, arrogant, unsympathetic caricature that people can collectively loathe and secretly admire at the same time. And while there are surely individuals who fit the DSM description, they're pretty rare. Research suggests that diagnosable NPD using the DSM criteria is found in less than 1% of the general population, making it the least diagnosed of all personality disorders. To put it bluntly, the construct is invalid. It doesn't describe the actual clinical population, and since that's its one job, it either needs to be significantly revised or thrown out altogether so we can build a construct that's actually valid from the ground up. With the rise of social media, the ready-made scapegoat of NPD has exploded in popularity. It's extraordinarily easy to become convinced that whoever mistreated you was, in fact, a narcissist. And if they didn't seem to align totally with the DSM criteria, well, that's okay. That just makes them a covert narcissist, a secret narcissist who masked as someone who cared when they really just wanted to use people as narcissistic supply, which is another loaded term that in popular use means something like emotional vampirism. And when you put these ideas together, it gets labeled as narcissistic abuse. None of these are clinical concepts. All of them are essentially pop psychology. And that alone doesn't make them automatically inaccurate. But I think most people don't realize that these terms are pop psychology and that they aren't reflected in serious, peer-reviewed literature on pathological narcissism, or NPD, even though they dominate the online conversation. They've become the terminology of the popular narcissism discourse, even while being disconnected from clinical research and practice. Some people watching this might be thinking, well, so what? If psychology hasn't caught up with the reality of narcissism and narcissistic abuse, then that's on them. The stories of narc abuse and covert narcissism in relationships are so common and compelling that this must be a legitimate clinical phenomenon. I've been working in this niche for over a decade. I specialize in pathological narcissism and NPD. I treat narcissistic patients. I consult with their loved ones. I've heard some pretty terrible stories in my time, and my heart has gone out to spouses, partners, and family members who've clearly experienced something painful and confusing. But I also do formal diagnostic assessments in my practice. And over the last several years, I've built up a moderate sample, often with collateral interviews from loved ones. And what I've found is that many people referred by spouses or family members, people accused of being narcissists, don't actually meet criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. Sometimes there's no significant pathological narcissism in their profile at all. And to be clear, my assessments don't just go by the DSM checklist. I analyze personality and relational dynamics using standardized, empirically validated measures. I take full psychosocial and psychiatric histories. I screen for numerous confounding and comorbid issues: PTSD, bipolar disorders, anxiety, depressive disorders, dissociative tendencies, other personality disorders, and even subclinical traits and dynamics. I find that many people referred by loved ones are actually avoidant or ambivalent, obsessive-compulsive, perfectionistic, socially anxious, struggling with complex PTSD, or dealing with other personality-based issues. Often the perceived narcissism is the product of misinformation that the loved one gained from narc abuse channels or forums where narcissism is reduced to checklists and caricatures. Reports of behavior frequently circle around buzzwords like gaslighting, love bombing, discard cycles, and deep misunderstandings of narcissistic supply. What I'm saying is this: second-hand reports, however emotionally compelling, are often unreliable. And this isn't to invalidate the very real pain that many people experience in their relationships. I'm not saying that the pain isn't real. I'm just saying that the label of narcissism is often misapplied. When filtered through the charged perceptions of loved ones and ex-partners, behavior can easily appear not only narcissistic, but malignantly so. But when you subject these cases to structured clinical assessment, it often turns out that the person is struggling with something entirely different. To give you a sense of what this looks like in practice, I've seen multiple situations in my assessment work that follow a similar pattern. Imagine, for instance, an older man who's absolutely convinced that he's a malignant narcissist. His partner, after consuming hundreds of hours of narc abuse content online, has campaigned in their relationship that he's a narcissist and that he's been engaged in gaslighting and abuse for decades. According to the partner, this man meets every criterion. But when the assessment is done, a very different picture emerges. What you actually see is a man who struggles with alexithymia, rooted in early abuse that he suffered in his family of origin. He has difficulty identifying and expressing his emotions. He tends to conceal angry or hurt feelings, and he struggles with emotional intimacy as a result. His insensitivity isn't caused by low empathy, but by interpersonal fear of conflict and deeply rooted patterns of intimacy avoidance. His, quote, gaslighting isn't calculated deception, but poor recall for emotionally charged situations caused by a fearful avoidant attachment style. Yet he's also deeply concerned about other people, and he wants nothing more than to live with integrity and according to his values. In fact, narcissism barely registers in his personality profile. He has no diagnosable personality disorder whatsoever, and certainly not the combination of psychopathy, paranoia, sadism, and grandiose narcissism that characterizes malignant narcissism. And yet, because of the influence of his partner's certainty, shaped by online narc abuse content, this man has lived under the weight of a false and deeply stigmatizing label, convinced he's incurably disordered. I've seen this kind of misattribution more than once, and typically, when I give the feedback that the individual does not have NPD, I'm often met with full-throated resistance from the referring partner. At that point, the narrative of narc abuse has become more than just an explanation. It's become an identity, and letting go of that identity in the face of new evidence can feel impossible. Now, to be clear, I do also find cases of diagnosable NPD. I don't shy away from those diagnoses when the evidence is there. I have a fair number of cases where the partner's suspicions were correct. I find many people who are struggling with their own mental health vulnerabilities can be taken in by content creators who make strong emotional appeals that appear to validate hidden pain while offering the reassuring story that it's not you, it's them. Sometimes that story is accurate, but other times it's not. I've seen cases where the supposed narcissist was in fact terrified of their partner, so used to being accused of secret manipulations that they'd come to doubt their own motivations, a kind of unintentional reverse gaslighting effect. The more this person protested that they weren't trying to manipulate anyone, the more the partner became convinced that they were. Every denial was reframed as more evidence of covert narcissism. That's how powerful these narratives can become once they take root. Like I said, I have no doubt that there are legitimate cases of emotional abuse involving pathological narcissism. I've seen them myself, but I've also seen the other side, how these frameworks, when misapplied, can devastate people's lives. What we're really seeing here is the power of cultural projection. That's what I mean when I say popular narcissism. It's not a clinical construct, it's a cultural one. It blends together elements of arrogance, cruelty, manipulation into a single mythic figure, a kind of boogeyman. Now, none of this means that difficult or highly pathological narcissistic patients don't exist, because they do. Some individuals with NPD present with overt grandiosity that appears to line up perfectly with the DSM criteria. They're openly devaluing to me or anyone else who they don't idealize. They're externalizing, hypersensitive, even to the point of paranoia. But there is always, always, the counterpoint of vulnerability. I've never once seen a case where that wasn't true. Sometimes it takes a while to find. It's not something that the untrained eye would easily see, and it's certainly not something that the individual themselves would readily report on a questionnaire. But I have to say, that sort of presentation is rare. The truth is that the majority of individuals with significant pathological narcissism or diagnosable NPD look almost nothing like the popular narcissism stereotype. Many clinicians are already treating patients with pathological narcissism. They just don't always recognize it because they're looking for the caricature. One recent article estimated that up to 20% of outpatient therapy patients struggle with pathological narcissism. That number alone should challenge the myth. Narcissism isn't hiding in the shadows. It's present in our clinics, our therapy rooms, right alongside depression, anxiety, PTSD, and relational problems. But if you're busy looking for the arrogant, sadistic boogeyman, you'll miss the quieter, complex presentations. I can't tell you how many times I've assessed or worked with someone who has diagnosable NPD and who was told by multiple therapists that they, quote, can't have NPD because people with NPD don't seek therapy. Well, I'm here to tell you that they do. I work with them every day. As my platform has grown, I'm increasingly contacted by people who've seen my work and who resonate with the actual psychology of pathological narcissism, not the stereotype. They reach out for therapy and assessment, and many of them really do turn out to have diagnosable NPD. And they really do engage in treatment in good faith, because they're real human beings and not some internet fiction who just wants to hurt people. The myth of popular narcissism doesn't just stigmatize people, it distorts the clinical landscape itself. Therapists overlook patients who actually have NPD because they don't fit the stereotype. Loved ones cling to explanations that obscure what's really going on. And people who might otherwise seek help come to believe that there's no point because the cultural story says they can't change. The stereotype hides the reality. The reality goes unrecognized, and the stereotype grows stronger because the absence of counterexamples makes it feel even more convincing. The very way that popular narcissism is framed makes it unfalsifiable once someone is accused of being a narcissist. Denials are taken to be gaslighting. Alternate explanations are taken to be more manipulation. The growing divide in the relationship is seen as evidence of an impending discard. Even a formal diagnostic assessment from someone who specializes in NPD is often treated as insufficient evidence. So where does that leave us? The specter of popular narcissism isn't going anywhere anytime soon. It's a compelling myth, and it has the weight of thousands of YouTube channels, social media accounts, and internet forums behind it. But like any myth, it tells us more about our collective fears and projections than it does about the reality of pathological narcissism and NPD. That reality is much more complex and far less sensational. Narcissism shows up every day in therapy rooms. People with NPD do seek help. They struggle with vulnerability, shame, and defensive grandiosity. They can be extraordinarily difficult to treat, but the majority are more deeply wounded than covertly predatory. They aren't terminators, they're people. Until next time, take good care.